So one of them is collaboration diagram, and the next one was what you call the sequence diagram. So that is the last class that we had, and we came up with different diagrams, and in this case, we need to understand on how we can be able to implement these two diagrams. And that's why we were supposed to understand, in this case, that these collaboration diagrams that we are having, they are able to communicate using what you call the sequence diagram. And that's why we first of all came up with what you call the sequence diagram. And we were able now to define how these sequence diagrams are able to work and the limitations for coming up with the sequence diagram. Because we said one limitation that we have within the sequence diagram is what you call the time. Maybe one activity has come earlier than the other. And if it comes earlier, so it means that now it is very hard for us now to intervene on that. So in this case, we need to understand on how we can be able to understand this concept. And for you to understand this concept is now understand that we must be able to work with a specific time. Then we said we must work with a certain activity, and that's why we had an activity forum that we were supposed to discuss on that, and we are able to communicate on that so that we can be able to understand how these objects are able to communicate with each other in that. So after that, we discuss what you call the collaboration. And this collaboration diagram, mostly we were looking at now the activities that are supposed to be formed by this sequence diagram. So how many activities are we supposed to have, or how many objects are we supposed to have so that we can be able to work with a certain activity? So in this case, in a sequence diagram, we were using what you call series, and that's why we introduced objects, and there was a presentation on how we are supposed to define these objects. Remember, if it is a person, we are supposed to present it with a symbolic presentation of a person. If it is an object, we are supposed to use a rectangle, and in it, we have the name of that object. Then we underline that, and we must use a full colon to represent that this is now an object that is now, which is active at a given point. Then after that, the number 2 that we are supposed to discuss is what you call the state diagram. So from this, which is number 1, we are supposed to do number 2, and in number 2, we are supposed to look at the state diagram, the state diagrams. And when you look at the interaction diagrams, in most cases, what you can understand about this interaction, the state diagrams, is how these objects are able to relate different avenues or different methods. So we are looking at different methods. We are looking at different operations that we are having currently. Maybe this person is writing. So that is an operation. Maybe this person is the reading. That is another operation. So how are these operations supposed to communicate with other? So that's why we form one state with another. So if I can present using a paint, in this case, maybe we can be able to understand that if this is a state, so we present a state using this diagram. So if this is state 1, and then we are having another state, maybe it's able to communicate. We don't have this, so we are using a straight line. So we can have state 2. State 2. So this becomes the operations, but we must have an event. We must have an event. And this event defines, when you do this event, you are able to come up with a state number 2. But where are we supposed to start? So we need to look at now the symbolic presentation of a state and be able to come up with a conclusion on how can we define these states that we are having. I want to use my notes here, and maybe we can go directly to where we have states, and allow me to introduce these symbolic presentation that we are supposed to have within a state, which is supposed to communicate. So the state diagram is the same as the flow chart, but if you look at the flow chart, we always show and define operation one at a time. But when you look at a state, we are looking at the whole operation at once. So in a diagram, in a flowchart diagram, you can present different operations, but these different operations, they can be given only one name. So this is now the second point that we are talking about. We are saying it is also called state chart diagram, or it is also called the state transition. And if you look at these diagrams, we have said it has some defined definitions. And one of the defined definitions that we have is the state. Then the next one that we have is the event, and the next one is action, and the next one is activity, and the next one is transition. So we can say these are the important parts of a state diagram, Now, these are the things that we require in a given presentation so that the state diagram or the state machine can be able to work. So in this case, we can be able to understand the first one. Is the state of an object is defined as the values of an object. So we're looking at the state of an object, which defines the values, either the attributes or maybe the links that are supposed to be within the state diagram. Then we have the event, which signals something that is having or that is happening. Maybe when you click, right now, if you can present this, maybe we can say student. Let's say the student is an attribute given on that, or maybe it's a state, or maybe we can have another one, maybe driving. Maybe you are driving driving to the market. So which is this event that is supposed to be here? Which event is supposed to be here? So this event that makes you to make sure that now you can go to the market, maybe we can say, maybe we are driving a car. So that becomes a car is an object, but driving a car or a limousine car, where we can say this car is now driven to a market. So the operation or the event that is supposed to be here is driving. So drive a car, that is now the event is driving. So the event, when you drive, when you're doing driving, you can go to the market. So if you're using that simple presentation that we have. So in this case, we can be able to understand a very simple interpretation of what we can have within the event. We need to have an action. So what can we do? So as an example, maybe we can say, we are moving from this point state 1 to state 2. And when you have this state, the action or the event that has already been introduced there, maybe from state 1 to state 2, maybe we are driving. That is the state. That is the event. So the state is 1, then we have state 2, but the event is driving. So what is that action? So the operation that is supposed to be introduced here is now you get to the market. So that is now the action. So you are driving to get the market. You are driving to go to school, or maybe you are driving to go home. So that is now the one that we are saying is an action. So what we can say is that an action will not be given out or will not be presented if we don't have a state and we don't have an event. And this event, this action forms what you call an activity. So this activity, it is within a given time. So this given time is now, maybe you are moving from 9 to 10. That is the time. That is the activity duration. So for this activity, we are looking at the operations that is supposed to be taken, the time taken within that operation, and which state are we supposed to have. So that's why we are saying, if you come here and present something and you say, we are having state 1 and state 2, where this one can be an operation or this one can be an activity. That one can be activity. Like now, if you want to sell something, first of all, you bid, and that becomes a state. Bidding is a state. But before you bid, you need to invite. So invitation. So invitation becomes an event. So event invitation is the one that is resulting to bidding. So in that case, maybe you'll be able to understand this when you are dealing with the examples or scenarios that we have. Then you have transition. Transition is the movement or change of an event from one point to another. So remember, when you are using this transition, we must follow a systematic order. And that's why we are saying it's the same as a flowchart. But if you look at a flowchart, we are not looking at the whole operation. So graphically, what we should be able to have within here, we need to have a state. And this is the symbol of a state. And then one state that we have here, we have said registration. And after that, state name are adjectives. So the keyword here, we use adjective. And an object can change from state to state during its lifetime. This can be illustrated using the diagram below. So if you look at now, the state 1 and state 2, in between here, we are having what you call an event. And an event, you can present that event using an arrow. That is a pointing arrow, or maybe you can use an arrow without pointing end. So in this case, we can look at now other diagrams that you should be able to have. So I want us to present those diagrams that we are supposed to have within the state diagram. So remember, we should be able to have symbols. And most of these symbols, one of them is the start. So the first one is the start. Well, now the start is a circle, which is dotted. So we dot this completely. This is a circle, and we present that with an arrow. Then we have stop. And when you're using stop, we use a circle. And inside that circle, we have another small circle, which is still dotted. Then we can use an operation or an activity, or we can call it a state, which is supposed to be presented with a rectangle, but it is curved. Remember, we said these are supposed to be curved. Then from there, we are supposed to have a flow. And this is the one that we are calling event. And this event is represented with this arrow. So for this case, we can still have other activities or maybe states that are generated to form many states. Like now, you can have this state that is coming from somewhere, but we can have other states here, which are supposed to be performed at the same time. So if you have such a state, now in this case, we can say we are using join. We are using join. And this is the one that we say we use what you call a synchronization bar. So if you can look at this diagram, the state diagram and the activity diagram are the same. So that's why we are saying the only difference is how we should be able to give out the presentation or maybe portray the implementation of each and every diagram that we have. Then when you look at the activity diagram, we are still using joins, the same way we are using these. But the only difference that we have is when you're using a state diagram, we are only looking at the whole operation of a system. So it's like you are looking at a system itself. We are looking at a model itself. And the advantages within that, there are many operations that can be done within here. So if I have an operation X, which is a state X, now I can have 1, 2, 3, etc. Operations that are being done by this operation X. So we allow more operations at the same time. And that is why we need to try to understand how should we present this. And that's why I want to come up with a question here. And one question or an example that I have here is, as an example, consider a case whereby a client who has some work that needs to be done starts by inviting bids from the qualified contractors. So for this case, if you look at now, the contractor is an actor. But in this state diagram, we are not interested with the actors. We are only interested with the operations. That is another advantage. We are not interested with the actors, but we are only interested with the operations. And this time, we can look at the whole operation of a system, but not part of the systems that we have. So in this case, we are looking at the whole system in a given point. They then negotiate the terms of the contract, in which case the contract is legally enforced when they both sign the agreement. Work then begins and can either be completed via sign off, or it can be terminated, or it can be cancelled. It can be cancelled by terminating it. It can be cancelled by terminating it. So in this case, let's try to understand the scenario. Where are we starting from? That is the first thing that we're supposed to have. So in this case, maybe we can present a diagram. And maybe we say we are having a diagram that has a start. So we are having a diagram that has a start. Then we move to that point. Then from this point, we can have activity. Or we can have a state. But which is the state that we are having? So we are saying an example. Consider a case whereby a client who has some work that need to be done start by inviting bids from the qualified contractors. So first of all, you can do what you call invite. So we invite bids. So invite bids. But when you invite bids, what are we supposed to get within that? So client who has some work that needs to be done, start by inviting bids from the qualified contractors. So when you invite, what are we supposed to do? They then negotiate the terms of the contract. So in this case, we negotiate. So then after negotiating, what else are we supposed to do? So in this case, we can say, they then negotiate the terms of the contract, in which case the contract is legally enforced when they both sign the agreement. They then negotiate the terms of the contract, in which case the contract is legally enforced when they both sign the term. So after negotiating the contract, there is something that is supposed to be done. They then negotiate the terms of the contract, in which case the contract is legally enforced. So you enforce, so enforcing. So we enforce. So for this case, we are doing what you call enforcing. Maybe enforce. Enforce. But you only enforce when you do what? Legally enforce when they both sign the agreement. So in this case, we have an event signing or sign. So you negotiate, you enforce, but before you enforce, you must sign. Then what else are we supposed to do? Maybe there is something that we are supposed to do. Let's look at that thing that we are supposed to do here. Work then begins and can either be completed via sign off, or it can be cancelled by terminating it. So there are two things that are happening here. One thing that is happening is work begins and can either, because we have already negotiated and the terms are now acceptable. So within that, either begin can either be completed via signing off, or it can be cancelled by terminating it. So in this case, we have two operations. So one operation that we are supposed to have, it is either sign off. You can either sign off when they both sign agreement. One case that begins and can either be completed via signing off, or it can be cancelled by terminating. So you can have here terminating. So when you sign off, what are we supposed to have here? And when you terminate, what are we supposed to have here? So in this case, when you sign off, we are supposed to do what you call both sign them when they both begin via signing off. So you complete. So completed or cancelled. So if you look at this system that we are having here, we are having a system where we are moving from somewhere. And because we have already terminated our case, we must add. And we are adding at this point where we must add with the add symbol. Where we must add with an add symbol. So in this case, what we are saying is that there are two options that are here. There are those people that can use what you call decision. Maybe you can use a decision. It is still around in this case. Maybe use a decision. If it is now sign off, you can have an activity here. If it is another one that is maybe terminate, you can have another activity. But this activity, they must add somewhere here. So if you're using this, so you can break it here, or you can present the way it has already been presented in that. So that is now why we have presented this state diagram here. And that is why we are saying the first one, you have an event bidding. But when you are bidding, you are negotiating the terms. So the moment you negotiate the terms, you sign and you create an enforcement within the signed document. Then, if this is now acceptable, that is when you do some completion, or the next thing that you are supposed to do is either you do what you call termination. So that is now what we are supposed to present using a state diagram. So if you can try to come up with some advantages that you are supposed to have within the state diagram, is that the state diagram is very easy to implement. The second thing, you are looking at the operation of a system in general, instead of looking at different activities, and then we are still looking at different operations instead of looking at the people or persons who have done that. So we are not interested with the person who is doing that. We are only interested with the activity that is supposed to be done, the operation that is supposed to be done, and the many aspects that we are supposed to have within the system. So that is what you are supposed to understand within the presentation of this system that we have when you are using what you call the state diagram. So the state diagram is the simplest to understand when you are presenting it in a scenario way, because you only look at the whole system. So we are separating, we are creating a whole system within it. And when you create a whole system within that, we are able to understand the presentations that are there. So that is now a few presentations of what you are supposed to expect within the state diagram. And mostly, when you look at the state diagram, observe this, and these are the things that we need to observe. One, you can observe the operation. So observe the operations or activities or the states. Then avoid use of objects. Avoid use of objects So here we are not interested with the object, but we are only interested with the operations. Those are the requirements that we need. And then we must ensure that events, results, the next stage of the flow. So you need to look at the flow of the model. You need to look at the flow of the model. And that is now the thing that we need to understand within that. And if you have a question, maybe you can ask a question, and then I'll be able to answer that question that you'll ask at a given point. So I'm waiting for any question that is coming on from your side. Maybe we try to understand how the state diagram can be presented, looking at all those operations that we have within a system, and the presentation of how they are supposed to be improved from the given point. So we are looking at the system, that's why it is called a state machine. So any question? Yes, I'm waiting for your question or clarification on that. Yes, I'm waiting for your questions. Any question? Anna, Doreen, Evans, Grace, Matthew, Mwangi, do you have any question? Okay. What about others? So I'm waiting for others. Maybe they can respond. So are you able now to differentiate maybe the sequence diagram and collaboration diagram? So if somebody maybe asks you a question, what's the difference between the state diagram and the activity diagram? What's the difference? Maybe somebody can answer that. What's the main difference between the state diagram and the activity diagram? Yes? What's the difference between the activity diagram and the sequence diagram? What's the difference? Please, can you respond to that before we proceed? Okay, state diagram is easy to implement. Yes, that is correct. State diagram is easy to implement. Compared to activity diagram, the main difference between activity diagram and sequence diagram is that the activity diagram represents the flow of activities, or the sequence diagram represents the sequence of messages flowing from one object to another. That one is okay, but I can make it very clear that when you use the state diagram, we are presenting the flow of the messages on a given object. That is, yes, from one object to another. So done by an object. Done by an object. Because when you say from one object to another, so it means that now it is only defined from a specific object. So it's like now, if you talk about, remember when you're talking about the activity diagram, we are looking at the first flow. Maybe if it is a student, we look at now the operation of a student. If it's the other one, we look at the operation of the other one. So for this case, we are looking at the whole operation. We don't know whether this is person X or person Y. So you can say it's a presentation of a messages from one to another. So I think that one is still okay with that. So that is now a given presentation of what we call dynamic model. And in this case, we are able now to understand that when you're looking at these objects, we are able to follow a specific form or format. And this form or the format that we are supposed to follow is to understand about now, how are we supposed to implement them? So the way we are implementing them, are we able now to implement them in an efficient way? So what are we supposed to look at? So which thing are we supposed to bring into our consideration? So the first thing, we need to know which are the symbols that we are supposed to use, because these symbols are not the same. These symbols are not the same. Because when you look at the objects that we are having, we find that these objects, or maybe if you look at the activity, they are presented with a different presentation. And this different presentation that we are having, it is the one that now able to define whether it is a state diagram or whether it is a sequence diagram. So in this scenario, we will be able to understand, first of all, the symbols that are supposed to be used. Then we understand the flow. What are we interested with first? Then when you look at that, maybe we can look at now the presentation of a given scenario. So when you look at the presentation of a given scenario, that is the point that now we can be able to look at now the presentation of that scenario with respect to the models or the diagrams that we have. So if the diagrams are now clearly stated, so automatically you'll be able now to understand the concept. So is there any question up to that point? Are we able now to come up with a structural diagram of a sequence diagram, collaboration diagram, state diagram, maybe use case and activity diagram? So are we having any question? Can you answer those parts? So if you look at the previous question that we discussed, are you able to answer them before we proceed? Are we able to answer them? So I'm waiting for that so that we can proceed. So I'm waiting for that so that we can proceed, my friends. So that is what we have covered from this point. Maybe we can look at them. So we started from the static diagrams, and we looked at the class diagram. Then from the class diagram, we had some introduction on how they are related to each other. Then from there, we came to what you call the association, realization, etc. Those are all presentation of static diagram. Then after that, we came to what you call the behavioral diagram. And the behavioral diagram, we discussed use case diagrams, activity diagrams, and that's why we are saying we need to follow the guidelines on all the symbols that you're supposed to use when you're coming up with use cases. And then after that, we discussed on the activity diagrams. And on the activity diagrams, I remember saying that we don't have much difference with what you call the flowchart diagrams. But for this case, we are looking at all activities that are supposed to be introduced within a system and that are supposed to work within a given system. And that's why we need to understand the presentation of these tables are given with the workflows that are given to each and every system that we have. So in this case, we still looked at the activity diagrams in a way that we should be able to present that, and that's why we came up with what you call the flow and the symbols that we are supposed to use in this presentation. And then after that, we came up with a very simple interpretation on which are the requirements. And we said it has the initial state and the final state, it must have that. So without the initial state and without the final state, because I have seen some students drawing a diagram, and when you're drawing these diagrams, you don't have an initial state and you don't have a final state. So that now results to some issues when you're communicating from one event to another or from one object to another. Then after that, the transition flow control the activities from one activity to another. So in this case, we are looking at activity one with an activity with another activity. So activity one cannot be completed. If activity one is not complete, activity two will not be done. That is one of the restrictions that we have within the activity diagrams. So you must complete. It is the same case when you look at the state diagram. We are having the same presentation that you must complete the first operation before we go to the next one, because the first operation is the one that is defining the second operation. Activity diagram, we said it's a sequence. The same case, we have looked at the state diagram. That's why we are saying the only difference is a slight difference only on messaging, only on communication. Because if you look at now the flow of these questions that we have, we can be able to understand that the only difference that we have is how they are supposed to be introduced from one bit to another. So how the message is supposed to communicate from one point to another. That is the only difference that we have. Then after that, we looked at now the characteristics. We said maybe we can have some swim lanes where we can be able to move from one activity to another without loss of the content within the communication. And within this point, we can be able to understand very clearly that the system should be able to have some activity 1, activity 2, activity 3, etc. So in this case, we are still interested with the actors, but we are not displaying them in our presentation. We are not displaying them in our presentation. So that's why we are saying activity diagram and the state diagram has the same presentations. If you look at the advantages that we looked at, it has the greater strength of activity, because if you look at that, that is what's supposed to be done. Like now, you can look at maybe preparing supper. Maybe preparing supper. That is an operation. Preparing supper is an operation. But how many activities are done at the same time? Or how many activities are supposed to be done at that time? Maybe we have the first activity, maybe prepare, if it is, maybe you prepare beans, sukuma wiki, maybe you prepare carrots, maybe you prepare onions. All those are different activities. That's why we say, when you have the activity diagram, we are now looking at individual activities. But for the state diagram, we are not looking at the individual activity. We are all looking for the whole system that we have. So that is the first concern that we are supposed to have. And that's why we understand that the system becomes easier when you present different activity one at a time. So we can have a very clear presentation that activity is more easier to understand than when you have the state diagram. Because in a state diagram, we are looking at the whole system. Maybe you are looking at preparing supper. But if you look at preparing supper in different activities that we have, we'll be able to have different views of interpretations. These different views of interpretations are the ones that we need to look at in a concern of those. So we can say activity diagram is better, is best in terms of use than when you use what you call the state diagram. But in terms of implementation, the state diagram is easier to implement than when we are using what you call the activity diagram, because we require a lot of involvement. So in this case, we still looked at now the diagrams that we are supposed to use in activity diagrams. I think we have talked about this. Please, you should be able to know how we can be able to use them. Don't mix them when you're using them. Be able to use them one by one and be able to work with them at a given point. Then after that, we can look at this aspect of now the dynamic model. And that's why we said, when you look at the dynamic model, we are looking at the change mode. That is what we said, dynamism, or the change of an object from one point to another. And that change from one point to another is the one that we need to understand in a real way or in a simple way. And in this case, we are able now to interpret it very easily. We are able now to understand it very easily. Because now, as the objects are changing from one point to another, we are able now to look at a given scenario in a way that they are supposed to be presented. And that's why we said this is the simplest of all to create, because you are looking at the time, the change of time. Maybe we are moving from, there is a time that you are looking at this time in school. Maybe after 5 years, you'll be somewhere else. Maybe after 10 years, you'll be somewhere else. So we are looking at the change of event from one point to another. So for that case, that's why we have looked at the interaction diagram. Maybe we have looked at the sequence diagram. And then the last point that we discussed is what you call the state diagram. So I want you to go through. Maybe you go through, I give you 5 minutes, you brainstorm, maybe you look at some issues that we have within those, then you can tell me. Then if you have an issue, maybe we can repeat again. So please, if you have an issue on those diagrams, you can raise a question on that. So you can tell me whether you have an issue. Yes, do you have any question now? Okay, explain component diagram. So this is now the next class that we are supposed to discuss. So on component diagrams, this is the next class that we are supposed to discuss. So please, I will respond to that. So on use of an example, can you kindly explain on interaction diagram? So what we have said about the interaction diagram is like we can have some events that we have. Maybe I say, maybe we are looking at examination time. So maybe you're supposed to sit for before you sit for an examination, what are you supposed to do? One, you register the unit, registration of the unit. Then after registration of the unit, what are you supposed to do? Maybe the HOD approves. Then after the HOD approves, so you register before that, maybe you pay fees. When you pay fee, you register for the unit. Then when you register for this unit, the HOD approves. Then when the HOD approves, maybe you download exam card. You download the exam card. Now, those are simple interpretation of an interaction diagram, meaning you cannot register a unit if you have not paid the school fees. The HOD cannot approve if you have not registered these units. You cannot download the exam if the HOD has not approved. So the HOD must approve so that you can download the exam. And that is now a way of interacting. But the way of interacting, you need to look at now, when are we supposed to interact? Are we interacting? So, sorry, I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry. So what I'm saying is that if you look at the examination, maybe you are doing an exam, maybe examination time. Before you sit for an exam, there are some things that you need to look at. One, you need to look at one thing here, pay fees. Then you register for the unit. Then when you register for the unit, the next thing is the HOD approves that registration. When the HOD approves that registration, the next thing is downloading an exam card. Now, what we are saying is that when you're using an interaction diagram, in our own interpretation, a simple interpretation for this, we can say we cannot register for the unit if you have not paid fees. So automatically the system should reject. You cannot, the HOD cannot approve the units if you have not registered for these units. You cannot download the exam if the HOD has not approved those units. So in this case, what you can say is that there is a sequence of activities. This sequence of activities, those are the ones that you call in one word interactions. And those interactions are the ones that we are supposed to draw them using what you call the collaboration diagram and the sequence diagram. That is what I'm looking at in terms of the presentations that we have within the system that we are supposed to have. So look at the way of doing something. Look at an event that is supposed to take time. Maybe when you are building a house, the first one is to lay out the foundation. Then foundation, maybe you start with the cementing. Maybe after cementing, maybe you do that. After that, you do finish. So there are those activities that moves with time. And those activities that moves with times are the ones that we are saying, those are the sequence activities that we have. So that's why we said we can use one of the collaboration diagram, or you can use one of the interaction diagram that we have. So that is what we are supposed to expect within the interaction diagram. An event that takes time with respect, an event that takes time or that goes with time. And that's why if you look at this, consists of a set of objects, and these relations include the message that may be passed among them. So there is a message that is supposed to be passed, but this message that is supposed to be passed, it is supposed to be passed at a given time. It is not all the time, it is at a given time. So please, if you have a question, I'm still responding to those questions. So I hope, Doreen, I have answered your question. Doreen, have I answered your question, please? Okay, so is there any other question that maybe we can respond? Yes, I'm still waiting for another response, please. So can we proceed? So can we proceed? So the next thing that we are supposed to cover, remember that now we are supposed to go to the next level of presentation. And so that now after we complete, maybe we can go back again, we do some other questions. So this is where we are supposed to look at component and deployment diagrams. And these are the diagrams that we are supposed to look at. Then the last diagram that we are supposed to look at is the package. So I wanted us maybe first of all, try to understand the others that we have already tackled. Then maybe from next week, we can start from the component diagrams and deployment diagrams. Then after that, we go to the package. Then we complete the diagrams. Then after completing the diagrams, I'm expecting maybe next week, but when we can do some scenarios. And when you do some scenarios, then after that, we can now complete with the software applications or implementations where we say software development and the process. That will be our last topic that we are supposed to discuss on that. So let us agree. Can we proceed or maybe we start this next week? Can we proceed or we start that next week? So what I'm saying is that we are supposed to look at the component diagrams as the next topic on the deployment diagram. So the next one that is remaining is what we call the package diagrams. The package diagrams. And within this case that we are supposed to have component diagrams and the deployment diagrams. And the package diagrams are the ones that are now remaining as UML diagrams that we are supposed to cover. And for this case, we are now supposed to complete with this. Then after completing with this, we go to software development programs or processes or procedures. Then after that, we end our syllabus. But the question that I want to ask is, are we able, maybe, can we start this next week? Because I wanted us to start this next week. Or can we start? Can we start this next week? Then next week, but one, maybe we can have more questions on scenarios, I will post them on your portal so that now you try before we come to that class. That is next week, but one maybe on 10th July up there. Then after that, maybe we can try to do some other question. Maybe you can come up with your project that you are doing currently. Maybe one can come up with a project that he or she is doing currently, and then we come up with the UML diagrams. Can we proceed, or maybe we start that next week? Maybe we need to have a consensus for that. So can we start, or maybe can we continue, or we start next week? Okay, Kosiga next week. Doreen, I can see you are typing. Okay, let's proceed next week, and maybe you can look at the notes that I have already posted. And if you have an issue, you can use the WhatsApp, and then maybe you ask a question, I will still respond to that. Let's meet next week.